So, Professor Grilli teaches New Testament here at the Gregorian University. He's written extensively also on the New Testament and on the relation between the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and the New Testament. Thank you for being with us.
It's a very fascinating title, but it's very complex and a difficult one to really plan for. What future for the Pharisees? A brief word of introduction. Because of my academic and institutional commitments, I wasn't able to be present to listen to all the presentations in your conference. I'm very sorry about this, because the sessions I was able to attend were extremely interesting and had a very significant level. But I've had reports and news about the other sessions, so I apologize if there's any flaws in my presentation, which will try not just to prevent a summary, but also to see which prospects lie before us. If I'm allowed to start with an analogy, I would say that faced by the issue of the Pharisees, scholars find themselves in a situation which is very similar to the one concerning the search for the historical Jesus, and the complex problems could be summarized as lying around three pillars, one of which is ontological, who were the Pharisees really, another epistemological, what are the criteria in order to understand their real identity, and a third, hermeneutical, how can we interpret the texts concerning them. So around these three pillars I will try and present 5 propositions which I believe can be used as foundations on which to build a ontologically, epistologically and hermeneutically significant reading for the future of Pharisees in the Catholic Church and in other Christian confessions. Obviously, in such a short time, I can only briefly mention some of the traces, but I'd like to point out that they're not unique or exclusive. These are just suggestions based on what's come out over the last few days. So here are my 5 propositions. The first, the judgment that Christianity over the centuries, which Christians over the centuries have formulated on the Pharisees, is the stepchild of it will be necessary to have a discussion on new theological basis. Some Christian theology, like that of replacement of the covenant, of the law, of the people of God, and that of the accomplishment seen as perfectioning of what was previously imperfect, perfectioning the image of God in the Old Testament, perfecting the precepts of the Torah, have led to a substantial misunderstanding of the Pharisaic movement and subsequent rabbinic theology. The Pharisees have become enemies of Jesus, the representatives of the law, which opposes grace, the old, opposing the new. Only a sincere dialogue based on a new theological basis can lead to a rethinking of this image. In other words, today it's been possible to hold a conference on Phariseeism with Christians and Jews, because Christians and Jews, in their dramatic common history, intertwined and marked with blood, are travelling towards a profoundly different understanding of the relationship between holy scriptures, the never revoked covenant, and the peoples to which the scriptures and the covenant belong. The Commission for Religious Relations with Judaism, in its recent document, Why the Gifts and Call of God Are Irrevocable, wrote, the Church inside a new theological framework professes the Jewish roots of Christianity. This does not challenge the constant love of God for Israel, its chosen people, and therefore we delegitimate the theology of replacement, which sees two separate entities, a church of the Gentiles and a synagogue which has been replaced by the church.
Così il numero
And that was number 17 of this document. So I read, therefore, the contents of this conference in the context of the profound theological change that the Church has undergone in this last 500 years. And I think that only in the framework of this new theological context it was possible to conceive a new debate putting the focus on the Pharisaic question and on all other questions and issues that have been and still are the object of debate between Jews and Christians. Now, the second proposition. In the presentation of the Pharisees, which was made by the Christian tradition in the course of its 2,000 years of history, there was an uncritical assumptions only of the evangelical sources. Now, what clearly emerged is that in future times we will have to allow the two of them to come in contact. And what clearly emerged from the conference is that there are many images concerning the Pharisees, and not just one. And this is not only because in the course of the various epochs the Pharisees have taken on the tones of the different interpreters who dealt with them, but also because ever since the beginning, the Pharisees portrayed by the Gospels are not the ones of Paul or Flavius Joseph, or even less those of the rabbinic literature, without mentioning the many facets and the variety and the many contradictions within the same sources, for which a synthesis is almost impossible. And here I have another quotation from the document which I just mentioned, coming from the Commission for the Religious Relations with Judaism. After the catastrophe of the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, two new answers, two new reactions came about, or that represented two new ways of reading the scriptures, namely the Christological exegesis of the Christians and the rabbinical exegesis of that form of Judaism that developed historically. Now, since each mode involved a new interpretation of scriptures, the crucial new question must be precisely how to understand how these two modes are related to each other. But since the Christian Church and the post-biblical rabbinical Judaism developed in parallel, but also in opposition and mutual ignorance, it is not possible to find an answer to this question just resting upon the New and considering only the New Testament. And after centuries of opposing positions, it has been the duty of the Jewish-Catholic dialogue to bring these two new ways of reading the biblical writings into a dialogue with one another in order to perceive and detect the rich complementarity where it exists, and to help one another to mine the riches of God's Word. That is number 30 and 31 of the document. Now, we know that ordinary Christians, but also scholars of a certain stature, have made rash statements on the basis of stereotypes, inveterate stereotypes, so without having a real critical examinations of the different sources. in this regard. Now, Joachim Jeremias in the Jerusalem zur Zeit Jesu writes that on the one hand, the Pharisees formed a group that distanced itself from the popular masses to the point of contempt and exclusion of the populace, and on the other hand, that they had a strong influence on the masses to the extent that they played a real important role in the condemnation of Jesus. Norman Perrim, professor of the New Testament with the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, in rediscovering the teaching of Jesus, he writes that what provoked the Pharisees, who relied on merit and punishment for their sins, was the offering of forgiveness by Jesus to those sinners who were considered beyond the hope of repentance and forgiveness. Offering forgiveness, Jesus set Judaism on the road toward crisis, according to the author. In a contribution on the quest of the historical Jesus, Ernst Fuchs argues that Jesus' death is due to the fact that he proclaimed through his own conduct that the will of God was a merciful will. Now, we may wonder whether such opinions have any grounds on the basis of the critically scrutinized sources and of the countless instances that existed throughout the Jewish world in the time of Christian origins. Now, it is no longer possible for Christian scholars to address the Pharisaic issue on the sole basis of the Gospel and on the basis of the New Testament. This conference reaffirmed the need to deal with different sources and hermeneutics, and that this sensitivity, which is already nowadays very much widespread, will have to be ever more present and active in future times. Anthony Saldarini, in the summary at the end of his own contribution on the Pharisees in Anchor Bible Dictionary, provides, I believe, an interesting model. Maybe not entirely acceptable, but nonetheless very much interesting. The third statement, or the third proposal, to avoid a hermeneutic of Judeo-Christian conflict, it is necessary to deepen the understanding on our side, on the side of us Christians, the complexity of the Jewish world at the time of Jesus and of the Christian origins. And under the influence of Wellhansen, Busset, Schürer, and many others, this period was presented as an era of legalistic degeneration when compared to the prophetic Judaism characterizing previous epochs. The Hegelian evolutionary scheme meant and made it so that the reading of this epoch with the Pharisaic movement, seen as a symptomatic expression of the time, was completely believed to be negative. Compared to previous epochs, it was a sort of a deterioration due to a legalistic and materialistic understanding of faith. And we've heard the many testimonies today which were going along the same direction. Judaism therefore deteriorated and decadent, that was to be replaced with the rising star of Christianity. It is a traditional, monolithic concept that reigned in the age of Christian controversial opposition to Judaism, and that today no serious scholar would ever put in any such terms. Jules Isaac, already at his own times, wrote that Christianity was born out of a Judaism that was not degenerate but full of vitality, as demonstrated by the richness of Jewish literature, the indomitable resistance of Judaism to paganism, the spiritualization of worship in the synagogue, the spread of proselytism. And Parish Sanders, in the context of a treatise on Pharisaism in the time of Jesus and Paul, writes that the frequent Christian accusation against Judaism is not that some individual Jews misunderstood it and misused their religion, but rather that Judaism necessarily tends towards a narrow legalism, towards a case history that is an end in itself and which deceives itself, and towards a mixture of arrogance and lack of trust in God. But the Jewish literature that was left to us, and here again this is Sanders, is devoid of any such characteristics. The gift and the divine need were kept in a healthy mutual relationship. The minute details of the law were observed on the basis of more general principles and with the purpose of surrendering to God, while on the other hand, humility before God, who had chosen Israel, was encouraged and would eventually redeem it. Despite the thought of very serious scholars who also during this conference expressed themselves with similar positions and took similar stands, the Christian tradition understood very frequently the clash between different positions within Judaism as a clash between Christians and Jews. That is to say, without a critical examinations of the different interpretation of the Torah within the complexity of Judaism in Jesus' time, that was Judaism of the Second Temple. The clashes led to misunderstanding, and many of the texts were misunderstood. So in future we will have to follow a different path in understanding the different movements that existed at that time. From a historical point of view, it would be also necessary to redefine the Christian movement within Judaism, or rather, even better, the Judaisms of the first century, as many call them. As far as I am concerned, in the period up to the late 2nd century, the Messianic Jewish movement is neither something completely different from Judaism, nor a movement originally Jewish, then aborted, but one of the many Judaisms of the first century, some of which have had a short life, whilst others instead had a much longer history. Within this plurality, the movement that starts with Jesus and the Pharisaic movement are seen as brothers, but also as different. The Jewish scholar Alan Segal talks about Rebecca's children. Point number 4. On the image of the Pharisees that the Gospels offer, it is necessary to abandon a prejudicial dogmatic approach in favor of a historical critical approach. About the identity of the Pharisees in the early 30s of our era, we very little know, and whatever we know is polymorphic. The texts are much too fragmented. We have ascertained this in the various voices that have followed one another during this conference. Flavius Josephus, for example, in his works mentions the Pharisees less than 20 times, and in the Jewish War they were mentioned only 4 times. They are classified as a school of thought together with the Sadducees and the Essenes. And yet, although they are portrayed as a reforming movement, but without a direct power in terms of government, Flavius Josephus never presents a coherent and consistent image of their own thought and of their own internal organization. Something similar should be also said about the image of the Pharisees in other Judaic writings. The stories of and the sayings of the sage from the first century are very few and far from complete. And on the controversial figure of Hillel, perhaps those who say that Hillel of those rabbinic sources is not simply historical any more than the Jesus of the Gospel is. Maybe they are right. So if we know so little about the Pharisees in Jesus' time, why have they taken on such a great importance in the Christian tradition? Now, this is certainly due to the New Testament. that mentions the Pharisees almost 100 times, with the anti-Pharisaic front, which was represented above all by Matthew and John, and with some of the pages that have the mark of a stereotype which is massive and unfair. To be founded on a solid historical critical basis will then mean not only recognizing the existing diversifications in matters of faith and of experience in the time of Jesus, but also distinguishing between the various attitudes within a variegated and complex system, such as the one which has been handed down to us as a legacy of the Pharisees, with all the cautions that must be taken about the dating of the passages and the rather arcane language that in the treatise of Sota mentions a number of types of perushins. Professor Sievers rightly underlines that it is difficult to know whether the types of perushins mentioned in Sota 22 are to be considered as Pharisees or not. But anyway, I believe that Julisak also again writes that Israel was not lacking false worshippers, although Puritans that were very much pretentious. They were marked in the Talmud and in the Gospel, and it was true that there were some excesses, but nonetheless the facts, the texts, common sense, everything seems to be showing that the Phariseeism of the history cannot be entirely identified with hypocrisy nor with formalism. It is almost impossible, according to Herford, to imagine a greater deformation of history. We've seen many convinced Pharisees having a high moral value, and we know that this was testified by the Talmud and by the Gospels. To what extent, then, does contempt, which was witnessed by the Gospels, how can this be applied to the real Pharisees, to those of history? And I think that Isaac replies by saying precisely in the same way that the definition of the word Jesuitism is applied to the Jesuits. In many passages, Matthew is not interested at all in distinguishing in their multitude the possible good scribes and the Pharisees, to whom the judgment of Jesus does not do any justice. He does not even distinguish the scribes from the Pharisees, but puts them together as typical pairs of couples of adversaries of Jesus. The Matthew negative stereotypes does not hold, just as it does not hold the fact that one puts in the mouth of Jesus the following words: do and observe all that they do, the scribes and the Pharisees, or tell you, for they speak and do not do. So, because this seems to be a way to deny in toto their own behaviors. It is known that we say that Jesus healed all the sick and that he went through all of the cities and towns and villages of Galilee and Judea. Those are hyperboles which have a pragmatic intent and which therefore should not be understood according to their meaning as a locutory expression, but rather as an illocutorial strength. And now maybe I could approach the conclusions. Which image of the Pharisees in the theology, catechesis, and the homiletics of the Church can we consider? It will be necessary to consider the fact that the re-elaboration, the editorial re-elaboration that different Gospels have carried out on the Pharisees is not uniform and nonetheless needs to be examined critically. For example, the invectives against the Pharisees found in Luke 11 and in Matthew 23, although they belong to parallel texts, they seem to be profoundly different. And Klaus Berger, already in 1988, noted how Luke insisted on the coexistence in the same Matthew community of Judeo-Christians coming and originating from Pharisaism and of ethno-Christians. But in the light of the presentations of the past days, we must say that the situations of the community of Matthew looks as a much more complex one. In future times, it will also be necessary to distinguish between what is historically based and from what instead is a classical argumentative topoi or pre-constituted models or literary schemes that aim at the achievement of one's own goal. Matthew's perspective in his editorial elaboration and the intent of the scribe Matthew is the one of convincing his listeners and readers that the perspective proposed by him was true and fair. And finally, I conclude, it will be good if someone goes back to dealing with the historical critical level of the points of contact between Jesus and the Pharisees on the basis of what was said and not said by the Gospels. The search for personal and social transformation with a strenuous commitment to seeking to what belongs to the authentic will of God, which is a legacy of both the Pharisaic movement and the movement of Jesus and his disciples. The accomplishment of the Torah, which belongs to the basic structure of Matthew's Gospel, was not radically far from the search of Pharisaic perfection. And Master Hillel summed up the law in evangelical terms: do not do to others what you wouldn't want others to do to you. Here is all the law, and everything else is a commentary. And this seems to belong both to the tradition that governs rabbinical Judaism and to what instead seems to be governing the Christian tradition. Now, allow me to truly conclude with what I wrote more than 10 years ago in the last page of my book. What is the relationship between the two testaments? Now, in those who are not accustomed to considering faith in the proposed categories, a question may come up spontaneously. What is, or what about Christian identities? Aren't we running the risk of Judaizing the Christianity? And the answer is an observation of Rendorf. It is not a matter or a question of doubting about our Christian identity. On the contrary, it is rather a point of formulating it again and in a better way. It is not a matter of destabilizing ourselves as Christians, but rather the point is formulating a Christian identity in the light of the fact that Israel continues to exist.